Can you just explain to people what the idea behind it is, and what do you think it needs to have in it? Because there's a lot of debate about how far, which companies it should apply to. What does it need to be? Because the proposal's coming early next year, I understand. So, what do you want to see in there to really make a difference?
Yes, so the 28 regime is EU institution speak. EU Inc. is the product or the solution that we've designed as a startup community. But for those who don't know, the 28 regime is basically the exercise of how can we reform company law in such a way that we can create a pan-European legal entity that works as a standard, has a central registry, works digital first, API compliant, and we can build a modern version of what Delaware Inc. is to the rest of the world here in Europe. So people can actually choose to build a European company from the get-go. And the proposal from the European Commission on the 28 regime is coming at the end of March, I've understood yesterday. So we're all looking forward to having that presented as a regulation and not a directive, because you want something like that to be useful and impactful. You want startups to actually give a shit and care enough to actually start using it. And then maybe we'll have impact in the next generation. Right? It's going to take time for that to actually become useful and impactful. But we have to get the basics right here, right? If you do that in the way of a regulation, that means all 27 member states will need to comply, and it will have a solution that it gets implemented for everyone, wherever they're based in Europe. So that's what we're pushing for at EU Inc., to finally have a standard for it. So we don't touch taxation, we don't touch labor law, we don't touch insolvency law. It's just the basics of company law. You can incorporate, register yourself as a company on a European level. You can raise investment across borders. It just makes everything easier from the get-go.
Maybe we just need to cut and paste the Estonian company law. Make that the 28th regime.
That's a comment we get quite often, but imagine telling the French government, yeah, you're going to have to adopt the Estonian model now. That's not going to fly. So national laws and national company law and labor law will exist, will continue to exist, but there will be a useful, impactful layer on top of that called an EU Inc. or 28 regime, which is a stupid name because, obviously, what if we have a 28 member state in the future? So the number of member states in the European Union is not fixed. So calling it a 28 regime in the first place is kind of weird. But in any case, you want that sort of layer on top, but you would still pay your taxes locally. You would still have to comply with local regulations and whatnot. But,
Okay.
That'll actually really fund investing as well. It de-risks the investment or startup in a country. I know a lot of investors are really, really pushing for this. Yeah.
And that's the thing, so sorry to keep on about this, but if you're an investor in Europe, Spanish angel investor, let's say you want to invest in an Estonian company, that's a scary thing to do. If that Estonian company sets up a Delaware Inc., everyone understands it because it's a standard. It's fast, it's affordable, but everybody gets it and everybody uses it. So creating that kind of standard in Europe would be incredibly useful, but you also have to make it better than a Delaware Inc., because otherwise the choice is just the same. Like an EU Inc. or a Delaware Inc., Delaware Inc. is probably going to win because it has the brand and the awareness. So you want to make something that's even better. API first, digital first, central registry, make it fast, make it cheap. Just, lose the barriers at the beginning and you'll create a whole generation of entrepreneurs that start with a good sentiment when they start in Europe.
We'll call it Talent Inc.
Talent Inc?
Talent Inc.
Talent Inc.
Yeah. So, I mean, as a funder, investor, Christopher, there's always this debate, right, about, we know the US has pots of money and the EU struggles a bit. In your case, it's very interesting because, you get a lot of angel investors who make money, understand about startups, and then put back in and grow, right? And again, there's fewer of those around.
Yep.
So what do you think Europe needs to encourage more people to do what you do, or just to bring in the private equity firms and the startup venture capital investors?
I mean, I'm an American citizen, so investing in Europe is extremely difficult, especially, I live in Slovenia. I have to go through so much paperwork just to invest in a Slovenian company. They're not even allowed to issue shares. They can issue percentages of companies, and they have to go to a notary. I mean, it's quite convoluted. This EU Inc. thing would fix all of that. They would actually be able to issue shares. One of the things that investors are really scared about is there's no way to exit in Europe. You put your money in, you can, now secondaries are becoming huge, so you can get out as a secondary, but there's no actual way to have an exit, so there's no IPO, really, where are you going to IPO? If the company goes huge, how do they pay out? If I'm from one country and you're from another country and the startup's in another country, how do we distribute shares equally as a standard model? There is no model. That's why investors are just, I won't invest cross-border unless there's this overarching organization that invests for me, and then there's more money being taken out, and then they invest in the companies you don't get to choose for you. So it's too difficult. I think investments in Europe would double with EU Inc.
Right, yeah. And that's even, you've not even mentioned things like a capital union and these big projects they're having.
Right.
There's more basic level stuff. It's a problem that could be solved, I guess.
It's a country-based problem usually, but it's.
Okay, another chance to ask questions. Introduce yourself and what you do. We're very great. Thanks.
So hello everybody. My name is Samir. I have a startup in the AI analytics for supply chain sustainability. Cool. I have a very naive question. Based on your experience on the issues that companies face in terms of regulation, do we have a way, I mean, when I say we, I'm saying like the European Union, to have a kind of linearity in terms of constraints that we put in companies? Why I'm saying that is my first experience in entrepreneurship was in China. I was in the state-owned incubator. The first meeting that we had, we were like 50 entrepreneurs, and we were only 2 foreigners. And I was the only one that was asking questions about regulation. At that time, we were doing a SaaS in the English industry, English teaching industry. And to be honest, the answer from the expert and advisor was like, why are you caring about that? You just started. And I would say, I don't want to have issues, like especially education may be like highly regulated. And the answer was, just start to build your product, get traction, and then later you will care about being in accordance with the regulation. I'm asking as an entrepreneur, maybe not as a citizen, but is there a way like to ensure, like to help these small companies that are facing this issue of having fixed costs if they want to be following the regulation while they don't have traction, to let them grow and then later maybe let them the opportunity to catch up with the regulation without impacting that much the European citizen?
Yeah, I think I can take this one. So I think the advice that the person gave you should work the opposite in Europe, and actually I believe for every company, because it's much easier to build strong foundations when you're small. If we're talking about cybersecurity, about transparency, accountability, it's a good practice for business. So it's much cheaper to do it when you're small than to reorganize your whole, company when it's, you're much bigger, because it will just create a lot of mess. So I believe a lot of the foundations of regulations are good. It's just that the ambiguity of it and overlap are confusing. But if you are just starting, I mean, it's actually not that hard to build a strong base in line with cybersecurity good practices, right? If you're following, for example, like ISO 27001, right? It's a good practice. And there are also industry practices and frameworks that are actually very helpful. And then you will see that they're helping a lot of regulations because they overlap a lot of the times, right? But the other part that doesn't overlap and that creates confusion, this is the part that we're talking about. This is something that I believe needs to be harmonized and changed. But I think it's important to have, transparency, accountability, and cybersecurity as a base. So it's much easier to build when you're a 2-3 person company. With a technical person, a CTO should probably know the basics of cybersecurity anyways, right? So you don't even need external advisors so much at the beginning. And then these best practices can scale and it can help you with regulations afterwards.
I would disagree. Sorry.
Good.
Because we're talking about as a startup, you are trying to build a company, and just building a company, 99,000 things can go wrong, right? You're trying to survive every day. But in Europe, before you can even start building a company, you have to do a master's degree in what you can and cannot do or how things should be functioning and working. So a company in another market would just start, like in China, just start building and then have the money, have the resources to do things properly and figure it out. A company in Europe would not even start.
Well, I'm not talking about regulation. I'm talking about best practices for cybersecurity. And honestly speaking, if you have an incident, it's not a matter of regulation. It's a matter of trust and reputation to your users.
Yeah, so if
right?
cybersecurity is a whole other box
That's
of
a
things.
lot of
but I don't think your question was specific to cybersecurity. Otherwise, I apologize.
In general.
I'm
Yeah.
just
I think
saying
in
that
general.
regulations, a big part of them are cybersecurity, right? So a lot of them,
Well,
what we're talking
there's
about.
also like financial regulations,
Of
data
course.
regulations, labor laws, et cetera, which we haven't touched on the labor stuff, but
Sure.
yeah.
But I think we can all agree in this room that regulation is not inherently bad, right?
Yeah.
When we say we don't want less regulation, we want smarter regulation or simplified legislation, that's what we mean, right? We want regulation to be clear, predictable, transparent.
And easy.
We want to remove the uncertainty of it. And that's the thing, US and China also has rules and has regulations on a state level, on a federal level, but they're relatively predictable, they're stable, there's much less uncertainty and much less overlap. So the terms of engagement as a European startup are just entirely different from the get-go, in my opinion.
Just on that question of predictability, okay? So, you know, you all work in a very fast-moving environment. In the old days, the EU would set a regulation and then 10 years, 15 years later would update it, right? Now, the AI Act is already being rewritten before it's even really started, and probably would have had to be however good it was, right? Because this is a dynamic world. So I just wonder, how do you feel the institutions can sort of tackle this difficulty of keeping up, or at least, there are things they haven't even thought of, right, which are going to be invented in the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 1 month. So how do you sort of retrofit a regulation to combat that and prevent anything terrible without, blocking everything? Is it possible even?
I mean, that's why it's so ambiguous. It's all theoretical.
Sorry?
It's all theoretical. That's why it's so ambiguous.
Yeah.
I mean, regulations are written for lawyers for a reason, I think. But we don't have the money to pay for all the lawyers. But you can't build laws for the future. I'm really mostly concerned that the laws are going to change after I've built something. If I put 100,000 into building a product, and then in 6 months something comes up with a regulation, and I've got to put in another 100,000 to fix it. It's kind of not fair. So put in regulations that actually have examples. Don't steal. That's a good law, right? That you shouldn't steal. So everybody understands that. Make something I can get and comprehend that. Oh yeah, that's not going to be that bad. If I'm close to being bad, tell me and I'll fix it. Don't fine me, millions of euros. But make it so it's tangible, so I can understand it. So actually, most founders, any industry leaders can understand it. If it's so this and then maybe that, we're just going to build what we want, and then hopefully we don't get fined. Sorry.
And also quite important that regulation, when it's there or it gets implemented, that it's benchmarked and you can iterate against it and that you can improve it over time and that you leave the door open for things to change and you have like multiple options. If you make it very rigid in a fast-moving world like technology is, then you're always going to be running behind on things.
So you really want sort of principles-based rather than...
Yeah, reactive
rules-based.
also. Let's see how the market evolves.
Yeah.
Let's respond to it accordingly, but not try to set rules before the game's even started.